The rain came sideways across downtown Chicago at 7:42 on a Monday morning, and Vivienne Marchetti ran out of her own building with a phone still hot against her ear. The voice on the line had said the words no chief executive ever wanted to hear before 9. J.P. Morgan had frozen the company's $80 million credit line. She threw herself into the back of a black Ford Explorer at the curb. "Run every yellow," she said. The man at the wheel turned, calm in a worn flannel shirt. "Ma'am," he said, "my 4-year-old's car seat is right behind your head." Vivienne went still. The man's voice had not raised even a quarter inch. She turned her head slowly, the way a person turns when they already know what they are going to see, and her gaze landed on a small girl in a pink puffer jacket, brown eyes blinking up at her over the top of a stuffed rabbit. The little girl said hi in the small, precise voice of a child who had been taught to greet strangers. Vivienne's hand was clenched around a folder she did not remember picking up, a folder that contained, although she did not yet know it, a contract bearing her dead father's forged signature. She fumbled for the door handle. The man, whose name she had not asked, did not move. The Uber app on her phone said 22 minutes. The taxi app said no cars available. Vivienne Marchetti, a woman who had not asked for help from a stranger in 19 years, sat back against the leather seat and pressed her fingers into the bridge of her nose. The man in the flannel shirt watched her for a moment, then glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. The daughter was tearing the wrapper off an oatmeal cookie with great concentration. "Willis is 6 blocks from her preschool," the man said. 12 minutes if I take Lower Wacker. Buckle in. The booster stays." Vivienne climbed out of the back and into the passenger seat. And as she did, she became aware that she was sitting beside a stranger in his own vehicle for the first time in her adult life. He did not introduce himself. He merged into traffic with the particular smoothness of a person who had driven this route many hundreds of times. The wipers cut a clean half circle across the windshield. The little girl in the back seat hummed something tuneless. Vivienne opened her laptop on her knees and began to type. She typed the way a drowning person swims. The man did not look at her. He drove. The girl introduced her rabbit as Mr. Biscuit and waited expectantly. Vivienne, who had not held a conversation with a 4-year-old since she had been one herself, said that was a very nice name for a rabbit. Mr. Biscuit, the girl explained, had been her mother's. The man's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel. Vivienne, who noticed everything because noticing was what had made her a chief executive at 31, noticed that, at the red light on Wacker, the man's eyes flicked sideways toward her screen. He said it conversationally, the way a person comments on the weather. "Your Q3 receivables are double counted against the Halberd line. That is not an $80 million shortfall. That is a $32 million shortfall dressed up to look fatal." Vivienne stopped typing. She turned her whole body toward him. "Who are you?" she said. The man shrugged. "A guy whose daughter needs to be at preschool by 8. The light turned green. He drove." Vivienne did not type another word for the rest of the trip. She was committing his face to memory. He let her out at the base of Willis Tower at 7:56. He handed her a small white card through the open window. The card said only Adrian Hale and a phone number. No title. No company. No website. By the time she thought to ask what he did, the Explorer had already turned west on Adams and disappeared into the rain. At 8:58, Vivienne walked into the boardroom on the 67th floor of Marchetti Holdings, and she carried 2 things with her. One was the white card. The other was the certainty, brand new and unwelcome, that the most dangerous person in her morning had not been the banker who had called her at 7:40. The boardroom had not been built for daughters. Vivienne's father had built it in 1996, the year she was born, and every chair around the long walnut table had been measured for a man 6 feet tall. The board had voted her down 3 times on new chairs. They voted her down on small things and on large things, and the voting always took the same shape. Half the room nodded along with whatever Gregory Thorne said next. The other half nodded along with that half. The chief executive officer, who was 34 years old, and carried the same last name as the building they were sitting in, was nevertheless always the last person to be heard out at her own table. Robert Marchetti had built the company from a single warehouse in Cicero in 1988 and grown it into a mid-market industrial holding firm with $800 million in annual revenue 3 Midwest subsidiaries, and a credit facility large enough to keep 940 employees in healthcare and mortgages. He had been careful in every way except one. He had not written a transition plan because he had not bothered to imagine dying. When he had keeled over at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago, his hand still on the phone, his daughter had been left to inherit not only the company but the room of men he had built it with, none of whom had quite forgiven her for being 31, and a woman and his. Gregory Thorne had been chief financial officer of Marchetti Holdings for 22 years. He had been at her father's wedding. He had been at her father's funeral. He had stood next to her at the funeral, his hand at her elbow in the way that a man steadies a horse, and had whispered that her father had asked him to look after her. He had said it like a promise. He had said it like a gift. Vivienne, 28 at the time, had taken it as both. She had not known then that grief makes a person stupid. She had not known that grief makes a person take the first hand that is offered, because grief cannot bear to look up and find no hand at all. This morning, he placed a leather portfolio in front of her at the head of the table and slid it forward with 2 fingers. Marchetti Holdings, he said, was in covenant breach with J.P. Morgan as of close of business Friday. The credit facility was frozen. The company had 96 hours to inject $80 million or default into technical bankruptcy. The only viable solution, he continued, in the gentle and regretful tone of a doctor delivering a diagnosis, was the offer that had landed on his desk that morning from Halbert Equity. Halbert was prepared to buy 51% of the company at what Thorne called a supportive valuation. The supportive valuation was, in fact, 1/3 of fair market. He delivered the news in the slow and deliberate way that a man delivers news he has rehearsed. He paused at the right places. He folded his hands on the leather portfolio. He looked, in his charcoal suit and his silver hair and his expression of paternal regret, exactly like the man Robert Marchetti had trusted with his ledgers for 22 years. 2 of the older directors, men who had played golf with her father, were already nodding. The youngest director, a venture capitalist appointed by the family trust, was looking at his phone. None of them, Vivienne realized with a slow, cold certainty, were looking at her. Vivienne asked to see the underlying numbers on Q3 receivables. Thorne smiled. It was a kind smile. "Vivienne," he said, "your father trusted me to handle these things. Don't make this harder than it has to be." 11 heads around the table turned toward her in the practiced choreography of a board that had already decided. Vivienne felt her throat close. She felt the chair beneath her, the chair built for a man, and she felt the words, "Your father, your father, your father," the way they had been used against her in every meeting since she had taken this office. She nodded once, because she had learned that nodding bought time. She said the board would reconvene on Friday morning to vote. The room emptied. Vivienne sat alone at the long walnut table and listened to her own pulse. Then she pulled the white card out of her pocket and dialed the number. The phone rang 3 times. A child's voice answered. "Daddy's hands are wet," the voice said. Very seriously. "Are you the lady from the car?" Vivienne, sitting on the 67th floor of the building her father had built, in the chair her father had sat in, looked out the rain-streaked window at the gray river below, and laughed for the first time in 11 days. "Yes," she said. "I am the lady from the car." The girl said okay, in a tone of immense satisfaction, and put the phone down on what sounded like a kitchen counter. Vivienne heard a man's voice in the background. Surprised. Then close. Adrian Hale came on the line. She told him she needed to see him. She told him she would meet him anywhere. She told him she would pay him whatever he asked. He told her there was a coffee shop on Halstead, a block from his daughter's preschool. He could meet her there in 40 minutes. Vivienne arrived in a Tom Ford suit and stepped over a drift of crayons on the floor to reach his table. Lily was tucked into the booth beside her father, drawing what appeared to be a horse. Adrian had a paper cup of black coffee in front of him, and a smaller cup of warm milk in front of his daughter, the milk topped with a small heart of chocolate syrup. The coffee shop played folk music too quietly, and 3 other parents in fleece jackets were drinking coffee at the windows. Vivienne, who had walked into rooms her whole life, expecting them to rearrange around her, felt for the first time in years like the person who did not belong. Vivienne slid an iPad across the formica. Tell me, she said, everything you saw in 12 minutes. Adrian took a green crayon out of his daughter's hand, and his daughter, without looking up, handed him the green crayon. He used it to circle 3 lines on the balance sheet on the screen. He used it to draw an arrow connecting 2 cash flows that were supposed to be unrelated. He used it to underline the name of a Delaware shell company called Halberd Strategic Reserves, a name that overlaps 70%, with the name of the company now offering to buy 51% of Marchetti Holdings at panic prices. Whoever built this, he said quietly, did not make mistakes. They built a trap. The crisis is manufactured. Someone wanted you to sign on Friday at gunpoint. He spoke the way a doctor speaks when delivering a diagnosis to a colleague rather than a patient. There was no softening in his voice. There was no apology in it either. Vivienne, who had spent 3 years being managed by men in expensive suits, found that she trusted the absence of softening more than she had trusted any kindness in a long time. Vivienne stared at the green circles on her iPad. They looked like a child had drawn them. They were the most precise piece of forensic accounting work she had ever seen. Lily looked up from her horse. She studied Vivienne's face the way a small child studies a face when she is trying to understand the weather of it. Then she said, in the small, precise voice from the car, "Are you sad like Daddy gets when he looks at Mommy's picture?" The coffee shop went very still. Adrian turned away to adjust the scarf around his daughter's neck. He coughed once. An unconvincing cough. Vivienne, who had not cried in front of another human being since she was 22 years old, blinked very quickly at the iPad and said something about the lighting. When Adrian looked back up, his eyes were clear and his voice was level. "I need 24 hours, he said, "and your full general ledger. But I am not bringing this home where my daughter sleeps. We do this at your office, after 7, off any network they are watching." Vivienne said yes before he had finished the sentence. Outside, on the wet sidewalk, Lily reached up and tugged on the hem of Vivienne's coat. Vivienne knelt down. The little girl considered her, then offered her the green crayon. "For if you have to circle anything," Lily said. Vivienne took it. She held it the rest of the way back to the office. Vivienne's executive assistant was named Margaret, and Margaret had worked for Marchetti Holdings since before Vivienne had a driver's license. Margaret could find anything about anyone in 90 minutes. By 11:30 that morning, a thin manila folder lay on Vivienne's desk. Margaret had set it down without comment and closed the door behind her, which was Margaret's way of saying that Vivienne was not going to enjoy what was inside. Adrian Hale, age 39. Born Rockford, Illinois. Northwestern undergraduate, accounting. Northwestern Law, JD with a concentration in financial crimes. 12 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, Chicago Field Office, the last 6 as senior forensic accountant, lead analyst on the prosecution of Beckett Industrial 3 years ago. A $400 million money laundering operation that had taken down a sitting state senator, 2 corporate boards, and the man at the top, Lawrence Beckett, who is now serving 22 years in federal prison, resigned from the bureau the same year. No public reason given. Vivienne kept reading. Margaret had attached 3 news clippings. The first was the trial coverage. There was a photograph in the article that had been taken on the courthouse steps. Adrian Hale in a charcoal suit, his tie still perfectly knotted at the end of a long day, his hand on the elbow of a tall blonde woman in a navy blazer who was speaking into a bank of microphones. The caption identified the woman as Sarah Hale, lead prosecutor. The second clipping was an obituary. Sarah Hale, age 34, attorney with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois, killed in a single vehicle accident on Interstate 90 on a clear night in October 2 years ago, survived by her husband Adrian and her daughter Lily, age 2. The third clipping was from a small legal newsletter and was 3 sentences long. It noted that Sarah Hale had been the prosecutor who had taken Beckett's daughter's testimony, the testimony that had broken the case. It noted that Sarah Hale had received 3 threats during the trial. It noted that the FBI had ruled her death undetermined. Vivienne sat at her desk and looked at the photograph attached to the FBI clipping. Adrian Hale, 2 years ago, in a dark suit on the courthouse steps. His face the face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. She looked at the photograph she had taken with her phone that morning of his business card on the dashboard, his hand visible in the corner, a stain of dried milk on the cuff of his flannel shirt. The same man. She thought about how he had stepped away from that world. She thought about how a man with 12 years at the FBI and a Northwestern law degree had ended up driving a Ford Explorer past his daughter's preschool every morning. She thought about the man who had walked away from a career to keep his daughter alive, and she thought about how that was not a man you could buy or threaten or push. She picked up her phone. Her hands were not entirely steady. "Adrian," she said when he answered. "The man you put away 3 years ago. Beckett. Halbert Equity is registered to his nephew." There was silence on the line for what Vivienne later counted as 8 full seconds. Then Adrian Hale said very quietly, "Your father did not die of a heart attack at his desk. He died 2 weeks after testifying as a civil witness in our case against Beckett. Did anyone ever question that?" Vivienne could not answer. No one had questioned it. Her father had been 64 years old and had eaten too much red meat for 40 years. The cardiologist had shaken his head sadly and said it was only a matter of time. Vivienne had organized the funeral in 3 days and had not slept for 4. She had not asked anyone any questions because she had been busy keeping a company alive. When Adrian spoke again, it was in the voice she would come to recognize as his working voice, the voice of the senior forensic accountant on the courthouse steps. He set conditions. He would not be paid above market freelance rate, $240 an hour, because anyone who wanted to discredit his findings later would look first at his fee. He would work only at her office, only after 7 in the evening, only after his sister Hannah had picked Lily up and taken her back to Oak Park. He wanted a former federal prosecutor named Diana Reyes brought in from his old contact list, not a corporate lawyer. Before he opened a single file, Vivienne agreed to all 3 conditions inside of 1 minute. That night at 8, Adrian came up the freight elevator at Marchetti Holdings carrying a leather satchel that had seen better decades. Vivienne had cleared the small conference room off her office and ordered pizza from the place on Madison, the place her father used to send for when a deal ran past midnight. Diana Reyes, 51 years old, gray-streaked hair in a low bun, was already there, drinking black coffee out of a paper cup and reading her phone with the particular focus of a woman who billed by the hour. Adrian set his satchel on the table and took out a stack of legal pads, 3 mechanical pencils, a small loop, and a worn leather case of colored highlighters. He laid them in a neat row. Vivienne watched him do it and thought about how the people who actually did the work always brought their own tools. Adrian unrolled the documents across the conference table. For the first time, Vivienne watched him work. He was a different man at a desk. The flannel shirt and the dried milk and the gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder were all still there, but underneath them was a person whose fingers moved across a balance sheet, the way a concert pianist's moved across keys. He found the first irregular wire transfer in 9 minutes. He found the second in 14. He did not announce the findings the way a junior consultant would have announced them. He simply circled and underlined and moved on. Diana Reyes, watching from across the table, gave Vivienne a single small nod, the kind of nod one professional gives another to mean, "You brought us the right person." By 10 o'clock, Adrian had mapped the outlines of 14 months of fraudulent activity, threaded through 11 shell vendors in Indiana, 3 escrow accounts in the Cayman Islands, and a single recurring beneficiary code that traced, when you knew where to look, back to a numbered account, held in trust for the sister of Lawrence Beckett's nephew. He sat back. He rubbed his eyes. Vivienne, across the table, slid a slice of cooling pizza onto a paper plate and pushed it gently across the documents toward him. He looked at the plate, then at her, and something in his face changed for a half-second before it settled. He picked up the slice and ate 2 bites without speaking. "Thorne moved $14.2 million last quarter alone," Adrian said when he had set the pizza down. "But there is a second account I cannot trace from outside this building. We need internal access, and someone in this company is editing log files in real time as we sit here. They know we are looking." Vivienne felt the floor of the 67th floor go thin beneath her chair. She glanced at the door of the conference room. She glanced at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. Diana Reyes, without looking up from her notebook, said quietly that she would make a call in the morning to a person she trusted at the bureau, and that until then, no one in this room was to use the company network for anything. Adrian was already nodding. He had known, Vivienne realized, since the moment he had walked into the building. It was 11:30 when she finally looked up at the dark windows. Adrian was still working. Diana Reyes was on her third cup of coffee. The pizza box was empty. Vivienne did not feel afraid. She felt, for the first time since her father had died, that she was no longer alone in a room with the truth. The second night, Adrian arrived at 7, and they worked until 2 in the morning. Diana Reyes came at 8 and brought a junior associate with a laptop. The four of them spread paper across every available surface in the small conference room. Adrian's method, Vivienne came to understand, was to map money the way a hydrologist maps a watershed. He found the visible streams first, then traced them upward toward springs. No one had bothered to hide, because no one had bothered to look. They built the timeline backward from the present, 14 months at a time, until they reached a contract dated March 8th of the previous year. The contract authorized the transfer of $3.1 million from a Marchetti subsidiary into one of the shell vendors in Indiana. The signature at the bottom of the page was Robert Marchetti's. Vivienne's father had died on February 12th, a year and 3 weeks earlier. A dead man cannot sign a contract in March. Vivienne stared at the signature and felt the air leave her body in a single thin line. Adrian, very gently, asked if she had her father's signature on any document she had been carrying for years. She did. She kept her birth certificate folded in the inside pocket of her wallet, the way her father had kept his folded in his. She put it on the table next to the contract. Adrian took out a small loop from his satchel. He bent over the two signatures for a long minute. The room was completely silent. Diana Reyes had stopped typing. The junior associate had stopped breathing. Then he straightened. "Forged," he said. "The pressure on the downstroke is wrong. Your father wrote with his whole hand. Whoever did this wrote with their wrist. It is a good forgery. Whoever did it had 3 years to perfect it on smaller documents before they used it here." Vivienne began to cry. She cried the way a person cries when something they had been pushing down for 3 years finally comes up through the floor. She cried for her father, and for the questions she had not asked, and for the morning she had walked into the boardroom and let Gregory Thorne put his hand on her elbow at her father's funeral. Adrian did not touch her. He pushed the box of tissues across the table and waited. Diana Reyes, in the corner, made a note in her notebook and politely stopped looking up. Vivienne's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. One line of text. "Your father stopped asking questions," the message read. "You should too." Adrian read it over her shoulder. His face went the color of old paper. He stood up and crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled her chair away from the window, away from the open angle of glass that looked out across the city, away from any line of sight a person might have from a building across the way. Diana Reyes was already on her phone, calling someone Vivienne did not know, in a voice Vivienne had not heard her use before. "We are not staying here tonight," Adrian said. Adrian took her to his apartment in Logan Square, because the office was no longer safe, and a hotel was too easy to find. Hannah had brought Lily home at 11. The little girl was asleep on the couch in her flannel pajamas. Mr. Biscuit tucked under her chin. The lamp by the couch left on the way. Adrian always left it on. Adrian touched his daughter's forehead with the back of one finger, and then guided Vivienne quietly into the kitchen. It was 2 in the morning. The kitchen had a small wooden table, a window over the sink, and a single yellow lamp. Adrian made chamomile tea because it was what he made his daughter when she was scared. He set a chipped mug in front of Vivienne, and another in front of himself. And for a long time, neither of them spoke. Vivienne sat with her knees drawn up to her chest in a $1,000 suit. She looked, Adrian thought, like a person who had finally come to the end of a road she had been running down for years, without permission to stop. "Why are you still helping me?" she said. "You walked away from this world for a reason." Adrian wrapped his hands around his mug. The yellow lamp made a soft circle on the table between them. "Because 2 years ago I let them close Sarah's file," he said. "I told myself Lily needed me alive more than Sarah needed me right. I have been wrong about that every day since. I am not making that trade twice." Vivienne nodded slowly. Then she said no one had asked her if she was okay since her father died. Adrian considered her across the small table. Are you, he said. No, she said. Okay, he said. That is a place to start. They talked then, in the careful way people talk at 2 in the morning when the day has hollowed them out. They talked about Sarah and how she had laughed at his terrible jokes and how Lily had her exact eyebrows. They talked about Robert Marchetti and how he had been proud of his daughter in a way she had not been able to feel until after he was gone. They talked about how being a parent and being a chief executive were not as different as people thought, because both jobs were about carrying the weight of someone else's continuing. Adrian did not kiss her. He pulled a soft wool blanket off the back of the couch, the blanket Sarah had bought in Galena the winter before Lily was born, and he draped it over Vivienne's shoulders. When her head started to nod toward the table, she fell asleep with her cheek on her own forearm and the cup of cooling tea between her hands. In the morning, Lily padded into the kitchen in dinosaur socks and stopped dead at the doorway. Her eyes went very large. Then she wheeled around, ran back down the hall, and announced at full volume from the doorway of her father's bedroom, "Daddy." The lady stayed. Adrian, in the kitchen, in the act of cracking an egg into a pan, almost dropped the pan. Vivienne lifted her head from the table and laughed. It was the second time in 11 days. She was beginning to suspect there was a pattern. His phone rang on the counter. It was Diana Reyes. The FBI had been watching Halbert Equity for 6 months on an unrelated counterfraud investigation. 2 of Diana's old contacts in the bureau had been on the phone since 5 in the morning. They wanted a meeting at 9. They wanted Vivienne to wear a wire. At 11 on Thursday morning, Vivienne walked into Gregory Thorne's office on the 65th floor with a recording device taped beneath the lapel of her blazer. Adrian was 2 blocks away in a federal building, sitting at a metal table with 2 agents and Diana Reyes, listening through a single headphone. He had spent 2 hours the previous night teaching Vivienne the exact sentences that would push a man like Thorne over the edge. He had made her practice flat, then sad, then small. Thorne, he said, would only break for one of those 3. Vivienne had asked which one. Adrian had said small. Men like Thorne, he said, never miss the chance to feel large. Vivienne sat down in the leather chair across from Thorne and let her shoulders drop the way Adrian had told her to. She made her face the face of a woman who had not slept and was about to surrender. She told Thorne she had decided. She would sign on Friday. She would take the Halbert offer. She just wanted, before she did, to understand from him why her father had agreed to start this in the first place. Thorne, who had been looking at her with the soft, sympathetic eyes of a family friend, leaned back in his chair. His mouth changed. He had been undisputed in this building for 22 years. 22 years of nodding boards. He could not, in the end, resist explaining himself to Robert Marchetti's daughter. Your father, he said, should have stayed retired. He should have left things alone after he testified. He didn't. You should sign before you make the same mistake he did. Across town in the federal building, Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second. Diana Reyes wrote a single word on her notepad and underlined it twice. The agent in the next chair reached for his phone. Friday morning at 9, the board reconvened on the 67th floor. 11 men and 1 woman around the long walnut table. The same 2 older directors. The same venture capitalist on his phone. The same particular silence that had sat in this room since Robert Marchetti had stopped sitting at the head of it. Gregory Thorne smiled and pushed a fountain pen across the polished wood toward Vivienne Marchetti's place. She did not pick it up. Instead, she set a thick folder on the table, opened it, and began to read aloud. She read in the same flat, clear voice she had used on Thorne the day before, the voice Adrian had taught her at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning. She read the wire transfers. She read the shell vendors. She read the names of the 11 Indiana corporations, each of which existed only on paper, and each of which had been paid by Marchetti Holdings for services it had never rendered. She read the routing numbers of the 3 escrow accounts in the Cayman Islands. She read the name of the numbered account held in trust for the sister of Lawrence Beckett's nephew. When she got to the dollar figure of $14.2 million, the door of the boardroom opened, and 2 FBI agents in dark suits stepped inside, with Diana Reyes 1 step behind them and Adrian Hale 1 step behind her. Gregory Thorne stood up halfway, then sat down. The senior agent crossed the room and put his hand on Thorne's shoulder. "Sir," he said, in a voice you could have used to read a weather report, "you have the right to remain silent." At the same minute, in a glass office on the 42nd floor of a different building, two more agents were placing handcuffs on Lawrence Beckett's nephew. The two older directors who had played golf with Robert Marchetti looked at each other across the walnut table and said nothing. The venture capitalist had finally put down his phone. Vivienne, still standing at her own seat, watched Thorne be walked out of the boardroom and felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the chair she was about to sit back down in was actually hers. By 10:04, the first call from the FBI's Chicago field office had reached the J.P. Morgan compliance desk. By 10:14, the credit facility on Marchetti Holdings was unfrozen. The deadline had been 10 on the dot. The company had been saved with 14 minutes to spare. Vivienne walked out of the boardroom on legs she did not entirely feel. In the hallway by the elevators, the senior agent turned to her with a folder of his own under his arm. "Ma'am," he said, "the file on your father's death, we are reopening it on Monday." 10 days later, Vivienne Marchetti drove herself to Logan Square. There was no driver. There was no security detail trailing 2 cars back. There was a Volvo wagon she had bought used the previous Tuesday because it had 4-wheel drive and a child seat anchor system, and she parked it on the street outside the brownstone where Adrian Hale lived with his daughter. She had spent the 10 days doing the work of putting a company back together. She had fired 3 vice presidents. She had hired 2 outside auditors. She had attended a small private memorial that Adrian had organized in a chapel in Rogers Park for Sarah on what would have been her 37th birthday, and she had stood at the back and not introduced herself to anyone, because the day had not been hers, and she had spent the nights in her apartment on Lakeshore Drive thinking about a man in a flannel shirt and a small girl with a stuffed rabbit, and about all the ways a person could be wrong about what their life was supposed to be. Lily flung the door open before Vivienne had finished knocking, threw her arms around Vivienne's knees, and informed her with great seriousness that there were chocolate chip pancakes. Adrian appeared behind his daughter holding a dish towel. He looked at Vivienne the way a man looks at someone he has been waiting to see all week without admitting it. She handed him an envelope. Inside the envelope was an offer. The position was Chief Risk and Compliance Officer of Marchetti Holdings. The position came with the right to refuse any travel longer than 24 hours away from his daughter. It came with a work-from-home allowance of 3 days a week, enforceable in writing. It came with a private security detail for his family, paid for by the company, until the FBI declared the threat closed. It came with an unconditional veto over any transaction Adrian flagged as risk to the firm, even if the chief executive officer disagreed. The salary was enough that Lily would not have to think about college unless she wanted to. Adrian read it twice. He looked up. Vivienne, standing in the small front hallway, watched him read and felt her hands go cold. She had drafted 7 versions of the offer over 4 days. The version in the envelope was the one where she had finally written what she actually meant, which was, "Please stay close to me, but I am putting it in language you can accept." He folded the letter carefully and set it on the small table by the door. In the kitchen, Lily was pulling a stool toward the counter, narrating to Mr. Biscuit what they were about to do. "I will take the job," he said, "but not for the salary, and not because of you." Vivienne held her breath. "For her," he said, with a glance back through the kitchen doorway at the small girl now climbing onto a stool to reach the syrup. "So she grows up knowing her father did not run from the work that mattered. So she grows up knowing that the people who hurt her mother answered for it. That is a thing I want her to inherit. And one condition." "What?" said Vivienne. "You let me drive you next time," he said. "Properly." She laughed. It was the 3rd time. And now, she was certain, it was a pattern. Lily appeared in the hallway with chocolate syrup on her chin and dragged both adults by the hand into the kitchen, where she had laid out 3 mugs of warm milk on the table. The mug in front of Vivienne's chair had a heart of syrup floating on the surface. Vivienne sat down in the chair Adrian had pulled out for her and looked at the heart and at the small girl beaming on the other side of the table and at the man pouring orange juice with the careful concentration of a person who had stopped expecting to be happy and was relearning it from scratch. It was, Vivienne thought, The first morning of the rest of a life she had not known, she was allowed to want. 9 months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon in August, Adrian Hale stood in Lincoln Park pushing his daughter on a swing, while Vivian Marchetti sat on a green wooden bench with her laptop closed beside her and her face turned up to the sun. Marchetti Holdings had announced its strongest quarter in company history the previous week. The Risk and Compliance Division Adrian now ran had identified and stopped 2 internal fraud schemes in its first 6 months. Gregory Thorne had pleaded out and was beginning a 14-year sentence at a federal facility in southern Illinois. Lawrence Beckett's nephew had pleaded out the week before that. Lawrence Beckett himself, in his own cell, had received a new indictment in connection with the deaths of Sarah Hale and Robert Marchetti. The FBI had not yet brought the murder case to trial, but they would. And both families, for the first time in 2 and 3 years respectively, had been able to set down the question of what really happened. Lily jumped off the swing while it was still moving, the way her father had asked her 100 times not to, and ran across the grass and climbed up onto the bench and into Vivian's lap. She studied Vivian's face with the particular focus she reserved for important matters. Then she said, "Are you my new mommy?" Vivian looked over the little girl's shoulder at Adrian, who had stopped a few steps away and was very deliberately not interfering. He met her eyes and did the smallest possible shrug, which meant, "This one is yours." Vivian tucked a strand of hair behind Lily's ear. "I am someone," she said carefully, "who chose to love you. We can find the right word together when you are ready. Not before." Lily considered this with the gravity of a small judge. Then she nodded once. "Okay," she announced. "For now you are Vivi." Adrian, 3 steps away, laughed out loud. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from the chest. The kind Vivian had not heard him make once during all the long nights at the conference table. He sat down on the bench beside her, and he placed a small wooden box on the wooden seat between them. It was not a ring. It was a single brass key. "Oak Park," he said. 3 bedrooms. There is a yard. There is a room down the hall that is not anyone's yet. Vivian picked up the key. It was heavier than she expected. "Sarah's chapter is closed," Adrian said quietly. "Robert's chapter is closed. This one is ours to write." He took her free hand in his. It was the first time in 9 months he had held it for any reason other than to pull her away from danger. His thumb moved once across her knuckles and stopped. "Push higher, Vivi," Lily called from the grass, where she had sprinted back to the swings. "Push higher." Vivienne stood up, the key still warm in her palm, and walked across the grass toward the small girl on the swing. The afternoon light came down through the oak leaves in long gold ribbons. Lily kicked her legs and shrieked in delight as Vivienne caught the chains and pushed her higher into the blue Chicago sky. On the bench, Adrian Hale closed his eyes for 1 full second, the way a man closes his eyes when he wants to remember exactly where he was and who was with him on the day his life became good again. Then he opened them, stood up, and walked across the grass to join his family.